I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I heard light footsteps behind me. I turned around and came face to face with Pedro, my husband's son. He was standing there with that clumsy manner but with a look that pierced my soul. "Good morning," he said with a shy smile on his lips. "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, although my heart was racing. I went to get a glass from the cupboard and at the same moment he did the same. Our fingers touched lightly. An electric spark ran through my body. I looked up and found his eyes fixed on mine. There was an intensity there that left me breathless. Pedro didn't say anything, but that silence between us spoke more than 1,000 words. How did we get to this point? The question hung in the air without an answer. I remembered the discomfort I felt when I first met him. How strange it was to be the stepmother of someone almost my age. However, there we were in a silent and dangerous dance. "Is everything okay?" he asked, breaking the silence, but without taking his eyes off mine. "Yes, of course," I lied, moving away slightly, just a little distracted, I think. He nodded. But I knew that he noticed. What was happening? There was something forbidden and irresistible in that moment, the subtle touch of our hands, the intense and prolonged gaze, everything conspired to bring us even closer, and deep down I knew that this was just the beginning of something that could change everything. That morning in the kitchen was the starting point for a series of events that challenged all my convictions. As I finished making coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to cross a dangerous line, and no matter how much I tried to deny it, a part of me was anxious for this. When I came back from a work trip, little did I know that my life was about to change in a way I never imagined. I got home exhausted, and there was Pedro, my husband Joao's son, sitting on the couch in the living room. He had just moved in with us. Pedro was only a few years younger than me, which made the situation even more uncomfortable. I tried to hide my surprise and insecurity, but he seemed to notice. That first night we had a family dinner. Joao was excited to have his son home, but I could barely look at Pedro. Every time our eyes met, I felt my face burn. He was intense with eyes that seemed to read my soul. During dinner we exchanged furtive glances, and the tension in the air was palpable. As the days went by, I began to realize that Pedro and I had many interests in common. We talked about music, movies, and travel, and soon these casual conversations became the highlight of my. Joao spent a lot of time away due to work, and Pedro and I were often alone at home on those afternoons. Our closeness inevitably grows. I clearly filmed the first accidental touch. I was in the kitchen preparing a snack, and Pedro approached to get something from the cupboard. Our bodies touched lightly, and an electric shock ran through my body. I quickly retreated, trying to ignore the sensation, but Pedro just smiled and continued. What was he doing? From that moment on, each interaction ours was charged with increasing tension. The text messages started innocently, but soon became increasingly suggestive. I found myself dreaming about Pedro even when I was next to Joao. The guilt was overwhelming. Looking at Joao sleeping peacefully next to me became torture. I knew he had lost his trust, but I couldn't stop. The first big thing was about going out shopping. I told Joao that I needed to buy some things, but in reality I went to meet Pedro in a city park. When we saw each other, the sexual action was almost unbearable. We ended up impulsively deciding to go to a motel. The first kiss we shared was ardent, full of repressed desire. The next morning, the remorse mixed with excitement consumed me. Going back home and keeping my composure in front of Joao was a huge challenge. My fantasies with Pedro became increasingly bold, and I discovered that there was a perverse pleasure in taking risks. Pedro proposed a weekend out of town, and I lied to Joao, saying it was a work trip. The unbridled passion in the hotel room far from home was intoxicating. The fear of being discovered only increased, and the adrenaline when we returned to the routine, pretending normality was almost impossible. Joao began to suspect my behavior, and Pedro gave me an ultimatum: leave Joao or continue the affair in secret. I was in love, torn by Indecision between stable love and burning passion, I decided to continue with Pedro in secret, but his reaction was unexpected. He suggested a last meeting at our house. I hesitated at first, but ended up reluctantly agreeing. That fateful night, I arrived in the empty kitchen and found Pedro already waiting for me. Before we could do anything, we heard a sudden noise coming from the hallway. The shock and fear of being discovered were paralyzing. "Someone is coming," I whispered with my heart racing. Pedro looked at me, action evident on his face. "We have to get out of here now." But before we could move, the kitchen door opened. João was there, and the world seemed to stop. "You too? What are you doing?" João's voice was a mixture of disbelief and anger. I could not find words. The silence was deafening, and I knew that my life would never be the same. I remember those afternoons clearly. João, my husband, was always busy keeping the house silent, almost melancholic. Pedro and I ended up spending a lot of time together unplanned. He was young, full of energy, and there was something about him that made me. It attracted me even though I tried to ignore it. One day, while we were preparing a snack in the kitchen, I felt Pedro's hands lightly touch my waist. It was an accidental touch, but it left a deep mark on me. My whole body reacted instantly, as if an electric current had run through my being. I quickly moved away, trying to hide the tremor. "I felt sorry. I didn't mean to." "Pedro," I said, looking away, but I knew he had felt the same way. "It's okay, Pedro. It was just an accident," I answered, trying to sweat casually, but my voice came out shaky. From that day on, the tension between us only increased. Each meeting was charged with an almost palpable energy. Our gazes met and lingered longer than they should, and each accidental touch became more charged with meaning. There were afternoons when we found ourselves in the living room watching some random movie, but I couldn't concentrate on the screen. I felt Pedro's presence by my side, so close, so warm. He leaned over to pick something up, and our shoulders touched, sending waves of desire through my body. "What do you think of this movie?" he asked, but I barely heard the words. Interested, trying to hide what? How? I was distracted by his presence. With each passing day, it became harder to hide the attraction we felt for each other. I knew it was wrong, that I was betraying João's trust, but I couldn't avoid Pedro. He seemed to feel my eyes as he approached me in the kitchen, pretending to need something in the cupboard next to me. I felt his body close to mine, his warmth enveloping me, and more I wished that touch was intentional. "Do you need something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just getting a glass," he answered, but his eyes said something else. It was impossible. The electricity that ran through my body with each interaction. I wondered how we had gotten to this point. How a relationship that should have been familiar and respectful had turned into something so full of desire and tension. I knew I was on the verge of something that could destroy everything I had. I looked at João and guilt ate away at me, but at the same time I couldn't push Pedro away. He was like a dragon, attracting me in a way that I couldn't resist. The afternoon spent together became a constant test of our willpower. Every touch, every look, every word exchange increased the tension between us. We knew we were playing with fire, but neither of us seemed willing to stop. "We need to talk about this," Pedro said one day, his voice low and full of emotion. "I know," I answered, feeling my heart race. But even while we talked about the need to keep our distance, our bodies leaned towards each other as if moved by an invisible force. The closeness between us was inevitable, and increasingly I felt that we were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. I couldn't stop thinking about Pedro. The text messages between us became more and more suggestive. Each touch on the cell phone keyboard made my heart race. I felt a mixture of excitement and guilt every night. When I looked at João sleeping next to me, the guilt became unbearable. "What am I doing?" I asked myself silently. The erotic dreams about Pedro became frequent. I woke up sweaty and panting. It was almost torture. In one of those moments I decided I needed to see him. I used the excuse that I had to go shopping. João Didn't even suspect he was so involved with work that he barely noticed my absence. As he walked to the car, my cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Pedro. "Where are you?" I quickly replied, "I'm going shopping, but we can meet up." He didn't take long to reply, "City Park in 15 minutes." My heart was beating out of control. "I'll be there," I replied. I arrived at the park. Before I agreed, the place was almost deserted, a calm that contrasted with the storm inside me. I saw Pedro approaching. He was beautiful, with that smile that disarmed me. "Hi," he said with a soft voice. "Hi," I replied, trying to control the trembling in my hands. We walked in silence for a few minutes until he suddenly stopped and pulled me to a more secluded corner. "I can't go on like this anymore," he confessed, his voice full of desire and anguish. I didn't whisper either, my eyes fixed on his. Before I could say anything else, he kissed me. It was a burning kiss full of repressed passion. I felt electricity run through my body. "Let's get out of here," he suggested, his eyes shining with urgency. "Where to?" I asked, still panting. "To a motel," he replied without hesitation. We got in the car and we drove in silence. The sexual tension between us was almost unbearable. When we got to the motel, we could hardly wait to go in the bedroom. Pedro pulled me closer and kissed me, this time with more intensity. I felt as if I were living a dream, something I had never experienced before. That night, we gave ourselves completely to each other. The pleasure was so intense that for a few moments the guilt disappeared. But at dawn, the remorse returned with full force. While Pedro slept next to me, I stared at the ceiling, trying to understand how I had gotten to this point. Home was a challenge. I had to keep my composure and act normal in front of João. Every time he asked me about the shopping, I felt a lump in my throat. It was all right, I lied, trying to seem casual, but the guilt was overwhelming. The fantasies about Pedro became more and more daring. During the moments when I was alone, my mind wandered to those forbidden moments we spent together. It was as if I was living a double life. That was increasingly difficult to reconcile. One night, while João was sleeping, I picked up my cell phone and sent a message to Pedro. "We need to talk," he replied almost immediately. "Yes, we do." I knew that this could not continue, but the idea of stopping was equally painful. The tension between desire and guilt was destroying me inside. Every time I saw Pedro, the attraction was irresistible, and every time I looked at João, the guilt consumed me. It was a constant battle, and I didn't know how much longer I could bear. Pedro was becoming an indispensable part of my life, but at what cost? With each new message and each new encounter, the line between right and wrong became more blurred, and I knew that sooner or later I would have to make a decision, choose a choice that could change everything forever. That day the city air seemed denser, as if the universe was conspiring so that our destinies would finally collide. Inevitably, I met Pedro in a discreet park, far from the curious eyes that could recognize us every step I took towards the meeting point made my heart beat faster. My hands sweat and my mind was filled with conflicting thoughts. When I saw him sitting on a bench under the shade of a tree, my whole body reacted. He was so handsome, with an air of someone who was also fighting against his own demons. We approached in silence, and that moment seemed to drag on for an eternity. I sat down next to him and could feel the heat emanating from his body, mixed with the woody scent of his perfume. "Hi," he said with a low and hoarse voice. "Hi," I replied, trying to control the trembling in my voice. We stayed there in silence for a few minutes that seemed like hours. Only the sound of the leaves moving with the wind accompanied us. The sexual tension between us was almost unbearable. I knew that if we didn't make a decision soon, we would explode. "We need to talk to him," I finally said, breaking the silence. "I know," but my voice failed. I didn't know what to say. Pedro turned to me, his eyes fixed on mine. The intensity of his gaze made me tremble. Without thinking, I placed my hand over his. The touch was electric, as if a current passed between us. He squeezed my hand, and at that moment I knew we were past the point of no return. "Let's get out of here," he suggested, and I knew exactly what he meant. The decision was impulsive. In a matter of minutes we were in his car, driving towards a discreet motel on the outskirts of the city. The silence in the car was charged with anticipation. The science intervened with a red traffic light. When I finally parked, my heart, and it hadn't Even closed completely when Pedro pressed his lips to me, my stolen and ardent, the most rare. The kiss was everything I needed, everything I wanted at that moment. I felt his firm hands on my waist pulling me closer as our bodies pressed together in a frenzy of desire. I couldn't take it anymore, he murmured between kisses. His heavy breathing against my skin. I didn't even respond, panting as my hands ran over his body, feeling every tense muscle under his shirt. Our kisses intensified, and the passion that had been contained for so long finally broke free. We undressed each other, piece by piece, each movement filled with urgency. The feeling of his lips on my neck, his hands exploring my body, was intoxicating. We gave ourselves completely to that moment, without thinking about the consequences, without thinking about anything other than the pleasure we were experiencing. When our bodies finally came together, it was as if everything made sense. The world seemed to have stopped and only the two of us existed in that room. Every movement, every touch, every sigh was a symphony of desire and passion. I felt a connection with Pedro that I had never felt before. A mixture of emotions that made me completely lose track of time. After a time that seemed like an eternity, and at the same time, in the blink of an eye, we lay side by side, panting, trying to catch our breath. The silence was now comfortable, full of complicity. Pedro turned to me, his eyes shining with a mixture of satisfaction and tenderness. That was it. He started, but I interrupted him with the soft kiss was perfect. I finished without needing him to say anything else. We stayed there hugging each other, except for the tranquility of the moment, but at the same time a shadow of guilt began to form in my mind. I knew it was wrong, I knew we were playing with fire, but at that moment none of that mattered. I just wanted to be with Pedro, to feel his warmth, his presence. When we finally got up, reality began to creep in again. We put on our clothes in silence, both lost in thought. We knew that this would not be the last time, but we also knew that we were entering dangerous territory. "We need to be careful," he said as he helped me adjust my dress. "I know, but I don't know how I'm going to be able to look at João," I replied, feeling the guilt weigh down once again. Pedro held my face between his hands and looked into my eyes. "We'll find a way, I promise." We left the motel, and on the way back, reality began to hit me with full force. I knew we were playing a dangerous game, but at the same time, I couldn't imagine my life without those moments with Pedro. I was torn between guilt and desire. Between João's stable love and the burning passion for Pedro. And at that moment, I didn't know how to solve this. When I woke up that morning, a whirlwind of emotions overwhelmed me. Remorse was eating me up inside, but at the same time the excitement of what had happened the night before made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Pedro and I had finally crossed the line that separated desire from action. Now the reality of our choices was staring me in the face. I got out of bed, trying to compose myself. João was still sleeping soundly next to me, oblivious to the emotional chaos that was taking over me. I looked at him and felt a pang of guilt, but soon the image of Pedro appeared in my mind and my body warmed up with the memory of our moments together. As I went down the stairs, my mind was in a whirlwind. How would I be able to maintain my composure at home after what had happened? How would I look João in the eyes and pretend everything was normal? But most of all, I asked myself how I had gotten to this point. I was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when Pedro came in. Our eyes met, and for a moment time seemed to stop. He smiled sideways, a smile that only I knew. Now my heart raced and my hands trembled, lightly holding the coffee cup. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and full of meaning. "Good morning, Pedro," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He approached, taking a cup from the cupboard above my head. Our bodies touched slightly and a shiver ran down my spine. At that subtle touch I felt the electricity that always surged between us, now amplified by the intimacy. We had shared we need to talk, he whispered, his warm breath in my neck. I know, I agreed. I didn't have the courage to look directly at him, but not here, not now. The day passed slowly. Every moment I was near Joao became torture. The guilt was a constant shadow, but Pedro's memory of what we had done invaded me with an overwhelming intensity. The hours seemed to drag on until finally night fell and I was able to meet Pedro again. We met in the park, the same park where we had exchanged our first kiss. The sexual tension between us was palpable, almost unbearable. Sitting on a bench, we tried to keep the conversation light, but the urgency of our feelings consumed us. I can't stop thinking about you, he confessed, his eyes burning with desire. I couldn't admit it either, my voice almost a whisper. And Joao, Pedro asked, his expression softening. How are you dealing with this? It's hard, I confessed. The guilt is killing me, but at the same time I can't get away from you. Pedro held my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. His touch was comforting and exciting at the same time. He got closer, and before I could protest, his lips were on mine once again. It was a burning kiss full of passion and need. Every part of my being responded to him, and at that moment all my doubts disappeared. The next morning reality came back with full force. I needed to keep my composure at home, pretending that everything was normal, but every time I looked at Pedro I felt the desire grow. The tension between us only increased, and I knew we were playing with fire. Our interactions became riskier. Pedro teased me with subtle touches, intense looks, and suggestive words. In the moments when we were alone, the sexual action was almost unbearable. I found myself fantasizing about him more and more, even when I was next to Joao. One late afternoon, Pedro pulled me to a corner of the house where we knew we wouldn't be seen. We need to be careful, he said, his face very close to mine, but I can't hide what I feel for you anymore. I didn't answer either, my voice trembling. But this is so dangerous, Pedro. I know, he agreed, his eyes fixed on mine, but the feeling of taking this risk only makes everything more exciting, don't you think? I knew he was right. The adrenaline of being with him, of doing something forbidden, was intoxicating, but the shadow of guilt and fear of being discovered was never far away. Each day that passed, the tension between us only grew. I knew we were on a dangerous path, but I couldn't stop. The passion I felt for Pedro was overwhelming, and with each moment we spent together I felt more alive than ever. The routine at home became increasingly difficult to maintain. I found myself constantly torn between the stable and secure love I had with Joao and the intense and forbidden passion I felt for Pedro. But deep down I knew I would have to make a decision, and that decision could change everything forever. Pedro's proposal for a weekend out of town was irresistible. He called me on a Tuesday night while Joao was in the shower. His voice was filled with a mix of urgency and desire that made my heart beat faster. I need you, we need some time alone, he said, almost pleading. I knew it was dangerous, that every step we took us further apart. More than was right, but the idea of spending 2 whole days alone with him, away from the judgmental looks and the suffocating routine, was too tempting to resist. I'll think of an excuse, I replied, trying to disguise the tremor in my voice. That night, while Joao slept next to me, I made up an elaborate lie about a work trip. I told him that my boss had requested my presence at a conference out of town. Joao trusted me, and that only increased the guilt I felt, but the excitement of living that forbidden weekend with Pedro was stronger. On Friday morning I said goodbye to Joao with a kiss on the forehead and an I love you that seemed more genuine than ever, maybe because I really loved him, but I was caught up in a whirlwind of contradictory feelings. I picked up the suitcase I had carefully packed and left the house with a lump in my throat and butterflies in my stomach. Pedro was waiting for me on the corner inside the car. When I got in, he held my hand and squeezed it tightly. We're doing this, he said with a smile that mixed excitement and nervousness. The trip to the hotel was a mix of light conversations and silences filled with tension. Each kilometer we left behind seemed to bring us closer to what we wanted, and at the same time move us further away from what we should be. When we arrived at the hotel, we checked in quickly, trying to appear as discreet as possible. In the room, the door barely closed before Pedro pulled me in for a passionate kiss, his hands exploring my body as if Each touch could erase the guilt we felt. I had waited so long for this, he whispered against my lips. The unbridled passion in the hotel room was everything I had hoped for and more. Each moment seemed charged with an intensity one had never experienced before. The fear of being discovered mixed with adrenaline, making each touch, each kiss, each sigh more urgent and more necessary. That night, lying in bed, he held me as if he was afraid I would disappear. "I don't want this to end," he said in a low voice. "But what if we are discovered?" "We won't be," I replied, trying to convince myself as much as him. Saturday was a repetition of moments of passion and deep conversations. We went out for a walk around the city, but always careful not to be seen by anyone who might recognize us. We returned to room and we lost ourselves in each other again. On Sunday morning, while they were packing our things to go back, I felt a pang of sadness. I knew that weekend was a bubble, an alternative reality that couldn't last. And now, I asked while folding a shirt. Pedro sighed. "We went back to our normal life, but I'm not going to give up on us. Find a way to be together for real." The trip back was silent, both of us immersed in our thoughts. When finally we arrived at the corner of my house, he held my hand once more. "I love you," he said, looking deeply into my eyes. "I love you too," I replied, feeling a tear run down my face. I went into the house and was greeted by João with a warm hug. "How was the conference?" he asked with a genuine smile. "It was good," I lied, trying to hide the guilt that consumed me that night. While João slept next to me, I relived every moment of the weekend. The fear of being discovered was still there, but the adrenaline made everything seem more alive, more intense. I knew that what we were doing was wrong, but I couldn't imagine my life without Pedro. On Monday, the routine went back to normal, but something inside me had changed. I was now a woman divided between two lives, trying desperately to maintain balance without letting everything fall apart. The forbidden weekend was over, but the consequences of that act were yet to come. I didn't know how, but I knew that somehow it wouldn't end well. The double routine was starting to tear my sanity apart. Every morning became a challenge when I had to face João, my husband, with a fake smile, knowing that the night before I had been with Pedro, his son. The guilt burned my chest, but the excitement of betrayal still pulsed strong. "Good morning, love," João always said with that affectionate tone, while I tried to disguise my restlessness. "Good morning," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady, but feeling my hands trembling as I poured coffee into the cup. João's suspicions were growing. He began to notice my frequent outings, the distracted looks, and the lame excuses. That morning, after João left for work, Pedro sent me a message. "We need to talk. I can't go on like this." My heart raced. I knew Pedro was getting impatient. He wanted more than furtive encounters and stolen kisses. He wanted a decision, and I didn't know what to do. I found Pedro in the kitchen, the place where it all began. He was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed, his gaze intense. "We can't go on like this, Julia. I don't want to be this secret anymore." "Pedro," I started, but he interrupted me. "You need to decide, Julia. Either leave João or we'll end this." The seriousness in his voice made me. It scared me. I had never seen him so determined. "I can't leave João," I finally answered, finding my voice. "He doesn't deserve this, and I don't know if I can." Pedro came closer, taking my hands in his. "You can't have both, Julia. You need to choose." The indecision was tearing me apart. I loved João, but the passion for Pedro was something I had never felt before. It was overwhelming. It consumed, but what I was doing was wrong. I knew that. "You don't understand, Pedro. João is my security, my stability, and you are my passion, my desire. I can't choose between the two, so you are choosing João." Pedro's voice was cold, distant. He let go of my hands and took a step back. "I can't go on like this, Julia. I've waited too long. Please, Pedro, don't force me to decide now," I begged, but I knew he was right. I needed to make a decision. "I love you, Julia, but I can't be second plan in your life," he said before turning around and leaving the kitchen. I stayed there alone with my mind in turmoil. The routine became unbearable. João continued to suspect, and the tension at home was palpable. Night, while he slept next to me, I turned to him and looked at his calm face. The guilt hit me with full force. I was crying out for the person who had always been by my side, and it was eating me up inside. "Julia, are you okay?" João asked one day with eyes full of concern. "Yes, I am," lying, trying to smile, but he didn't seem convinced. "You have Been distant, something is happening, he lost, and I felt the world crumble around me. No, Joao, I am just tired, I answered, but he didn't seem satisfied. Pedro's pressure didn't ease either. He sent me messages demanding an answer, and I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I was torn between stable love and burning passion. Every choice seemed wrong, every path painful. Julia, please give me an answer, Pedro begged in a message. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I needed to make a decision, but what was? Joao's stable love or Pedro's intense passion? Each choice tore me apart inside, and I didn't know how to move on, and so my life remained trapped between two passions, not knowing which path to take, while guilt and indecision consumed me every day. That my decision to continue with Pedro in secret seemed to be the only way to maintain my sanity and the burning desire that was growing inside me. However, Pedro's reaction to my choice was completely unexpected. He seemed distant, almost cold. When I told him that I wanted to continue our affair but that I couldn't leave Joao, his eyes lost their shine and he sighed deeply, as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. You know that this can't go on like this. Forever, you don't know, he said, his voice full of frustration and sadness. I felt it, unable to find the right words. Pedro stood up and began to pace back and forth, clearly disturbed. After a few minutes of silence, he stopped and looked at me. I need one last meeting at our house, he suggested, his voice firm and determined. I was surprised and hesitated. The idea of us being together in the house where I lived with Joao seemed dangerous and reckless. But the intensity in Pedro's gaze made me realize that he was serious. I knew that if I refused I could lose him forever, so with a lump in my throat I reluctantly agreed. Okay, but we need to be very careful, I replied, trying to hide my apprehension. On the appointed night Joao was on a business trip and the house was empty. My heart was beating fast as I waited for Pedro in the kitchen. Every sound seemed amplified and the tension in the air was almost palpable when I heard the front door open and close. My body tensed. Pedro entered the kitchen and our eyes met. There was something different in him, a mixture of determination and sadness that I had never seen before. You came, he said, his voice soft but full of emotion. Yes, I replied, my voice almost a whisper. Pedro came closer, and when our bodies touched, a wave of desire ran through my body, but at the same time there was a shadow of guilt that I could not ignore. He pulled me close and our lips met in a kiss full of urgency and desperation. I do not know how much longer I can hold on, Pedro murmured against my lips. Let's make the most of the time we have, I said, trying to push away the distressing thoughts. As we kissed, the pain made my heart skip a beat. We quickly separated, our eyes wide-eyed with fear. What was that? I asked, my voice trembling. Pedro looked at the kitchen door, his muscles tense. I think someone is here, he said in a low and worried voice. My heart raced and adrenaline took over me. It can't be, I whispered, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the sound of footsteps in the hallway confirmed our worst fears. Someone was really there. I looked at Pedro and he pulled me to a corner of the kitchen, trying to keep us out of sight. Maybe it's John, he said, his voice just a thread of sound. I felt a chill run down my spine. If John caught us, everything would be lost. Guilt and fear mixed in my chest, creating a feeling of uncontrollable panic. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice a little louder than I intended. Pedro nodded, and we started moving towards the back door, trying to be as quiet as possible. However, when we were almost there, the kitchen door opened and John was standing there looking at us with an expression of shock and pain. The world seemed to stop at that moment. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. The expression on John's face was devastating and a wave of guilt overwhelming enveloped me. Joao, I started, but couldn't finish the sentence. He raised his hand, silencing me. Don't say anything, he said in a broken voice. I don't want to hear. Pedro took a step forward, trying to speak, but Joao shook his head, his expression hardening. I trusted you, he said, his voice filled with a pain I had never heard before. That night everything changed. The last meeting that was supposed to be a passionate farewell became the beginning of the end. The look of betrayal in Joao's eyes haunted me for a long time, and Pedro, he never forgave me for having chosen to keep the secret, and that last night marked our definitive separation. At that moment I realized that desire and passion had too high a price to pay, and although I could not go back, the pain of that last meeting would forever be etched in my memory, a constant reminder of the choices I had made and the lives I had destroyed. I arrived in the kitchen that night, my heart still beating fast. After lying to John, I said I was going to make tea, but in truth I was anxious to meet Pedro. Everything was already planned, but my stomach was still churning with nervousness and excitement. When I entered, the kitchen was empty, but the soft light from the lamp created an almost intimate atmosphere. Pedro was already there, leaning against the counter, waiting for me. He smiled when he saw me, that smile that always disarmed me, and I felt my body respond immediately. "Hi," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "I thought you wouldn't come." I couldn't resist. I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk," but before I could finish, a sound came from the hallway. We froze in place. Our eyes met in silent panic. It was a low noise, as if someone was approaching. My heart raced and I felt sweat begin to form on my forehead. If it was John, we were lost. "Did you hear that?" I asked, his voice trembling. Pedro nodded, his eyes wide open. "Is someone there?" he whispered back. Fear was written all over his face, but there was also determination. He took my hand, gathering strength. "Stay calm," he whispered, although he himself was far away. "Let's stay calm, let's solve this." The sound was getting closer. Light footsteps were louder. The hallway seemed longer than ever. Every second was a torment of uncertainty. I could feel the weight of the consequences hanging over us. If João caught us together in that intimate moment, it would be the end of everything. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, trying desperately to convince myself. "It's not the wind," Pedro replied, his voice filled with a gravity that made my stomach tighten. Even more so. I looked around, desperately searching for a way out. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, "now, but before we move." I opened the door, expecting the worst, but it wasn't João. It was just the house cat that had pushed the door with its body. I let out a sigh of relief. My legs almost gave out under me. "My God, it was just the cat," Pedro said, laughing nervously. "I think I'm getting paranoid." I also agreed, trying to calm my still racing heart. "But we can continue like this." "Pedro, it's too dangerous." "I know," he said, the seriousness returning to his face. "But I can't stay away from you. This has to end," I said, my voice firm, despite the pain I felt when I said those words. "We can't continue with this. It's unfair to João. And it's dangerous for us." Pedro looked at me, his eyes full of sadness and regret. "I know, but I love you and it hurts so much to think about losing you." "I love you too," I admitted, feeling the tears start to form. "But we need to be strong for everyone's sake." He pulled me into a tight hug and I felt the pain and sadness in every fiber of my being. We stayed like that for a moment, just holding each other, trying to find the strength to do what needed to be done. We finally parted ways. "Let's go back to the living room," I said, wiping away the tears. "Before anyone actually sees us here." Pedro nodded, and together we left the kitchen, trying to regain some semblance of normality. But I knew that that night had changed everything. It was the end of something that should never have started, but also the beginning of a new and painful reality. And as we walked back to the living room, I couldn't help but feel that somehow we were finally doing the right thing, even though it hurt.